Welcome back to another animal science class virtually. Today we are going to finish up our sheep unit, and this is the last material that I will be presenting to you. So I've had a really good time with you guys in animal science. I definitely enjoyed the class. So thank you, and let's finish up sheep today. So we're going to start today with reproduction. So you guys did a unit over reproduction, so we're just going to do a quick overview of how reproduction is important in sheep. As we know, conditions must be right to successfully breed our sheep. The body condition of females and males must be at an adequate level. The reproductive system is the only system that the body does not need. So if an animal is too thin and is having trouble supporting all of its organs and systems, then it's not going to support the reproductive system. And the body knows that if it becomes pregnant, that it has to support another life. And if it is already not able to support that reproductive system, then the body will not become pregnant. So being too thin is not good for reproduction. And if a ewe is too fat, she can develop metabolic disorders and also have issues giving birth because of that extra fat. So making sure that sheep are at an adequate level of body condition is very important to ensure that they will breed and be able to have lambs successfully. A ram can also have issues breeding if he's too fat or too thin. So too fat could cause issues for him to naturally service, or too thin can cause those issues as well. In order to tell if our lambs are in the correct body condition, we have a body condition score. And for sheep, it ranges from 1 to 9. 1 is the thinnest and 9 is the fattest. We want to shoot for about a 4 to 6 for breeding. So if we look at our chart over here, we have 1 being very thin, so you see very little fat over the top there. This is pretty good. This is pretty good. We're starting to get a little fat here, and then we are way too fat here. See all that? So that's how we judge our body condition score, is really just by the fat thickness on our animals. So if we get into breeding, a successful operation is very closely linked to the level of lamb production, because we are selling those lambs at market, and that's how we're making our money. So things that affect breeding success are fertility of the ewes, survivability of the lambs, mothering ability, and milking ability of the ewes. So like we've talked about previously, sheep are seasonal breeders, so they prefer to come into heat in the fall and the winter, so that's when we usually breed them. We have several breeds that are out of season breeders, like the Dorset, and we talked about them in our previous lecture. So in this fall and winter season, a ewe will come into estrus, and this is the time when ovulation occurs. It is also known as standing heat. This time will last for about 12 to 36 hours, and this is when we want to breed our ewes. If that breeding does not get done in those 12 to 36 hours, it repeats every 17 days. In sheep, we often see natural service ewes. One ram can cover about 40 to 50 ewes, and this really depends on the operation, whether it's commercial or really shooting for show lambs. That number can vary quite a bit. Often we will see people lease rams for a couple weeks at a time to introduce new genetics into the herd. AI is much more difficult in sheep than it is in cattle, and so that's why it is rarely used. In our picture here, you can see a ram. He's wearing a marking harness, so marking harnesses are used quite often in sheep to know that he has serviced a ewe. After the animal is bred, we begin gestation, and we know that gestation is the period of time from conception to birth. So gestation in sheep is about 148 days or 5 months long. During this time, ewes should have an increased nutrition, a better diet, because they have to have more nutrients to feed the animals that they are creating. Birth then happens, and birth is also known as parturition, and this usually results between 1 and 3 lambs. So they can have a single, twins, or triplets. Usually they are easily able to take care of twins, and singles. Triplets are not as easy to take care of because it's just harder for them to fight for milk. Colostrum is the very first milk from the ewe, and this is very important because it has lots of antibodies for those sheep to be healthy throughout their young life. So our sheep have been born, and at about 3 months old, we will wean them. So weaning is just when we take them off of the mother, and they begin their own life. So this cannot occur before 2 months old because the rumen has not fully developed. So when they are weaned, they are no longer receiving any milk, and they are only eating feed. In order to introduce them to this feed while they still are on the mother, croup feeders are often used so that lambs begin to eat the grain. So we can see in this picture that they can enter through these little bars right over here, and then they can go in and eat some grain. This way the mother ewes are not in there eating all the grain, but if the lambs want to, they can begin eating some grain. That just makes the transition to full grain diets a little bit easier. We will now get into lamb management. So we're going to cover 5 steps in lamb management. The first being animal ID. So this is important so that you are able to keep track of which lambs belong to which ewes at an early age, and then track them for your herd for the rest of their life. So we often see tags for individual numbers. Group or farm numbers, depending on how large the operation is, can be an ear notch or tattoo. And then scrapie tags are also required in the US. And scrapie is a disease in sheep that can be fatal. And so if this disease were to break out, we want to be able to track what farm it came from. And so that is why all scrapie tags are required in sheep. So if we look here, in our middle picture, we have our scrapie tag there. So that will usually have a farm number and an individual number. And then if we look over here on the left side, we have a tattoo there inside the ear. And then finally, we have our ear notch, which is very different from pigs. It's a very different system. And I honestly don't know the system. I think it varies for each farm, but we do sometimes see notching in sheep. Our next step in lamb management is castration. So, like we know, this is the removal of the testicles and can sometimes be referred to as wethering, because once they are castrated, they become a wether instead of a ram. This is usually done at about 10 days old. The most common method is banding. So this, you can see here, this tool has a band, and that band is placed around at the very top of the testicles, and it cuts off the blood supply, and after a few weeks, the testicles just fall off. Other tools used can be an emasculator or a bardizo, which are both shown here, but banding is probably the most common because it is basically a bloodless removal, and decreases the risk of infection. Tetanus should also be given at the time of castration because this may leave a little bit of an open wound that could be exposed to the soil, and we don't want them to get sick from that, so we give them a tetanus vaccination at the same time. Then we have docking. So at the same time as banding, we'll often dock, and this is the removal of the tail at the tail head. So you can see in our picture there, he's going to remove that tail at the very top of where the tail begins. This is important for cleanliness in sheep. It eliminates the accumulation of feces and then the flies and larvae that come along with that. Like I said, done at the same time as castration. And then the same tools are used for castration. So commonly we see banding, but those emasculators and Bargeza knives can also be used. Our fourth step is hoof trimming, and this is something that will need to be done throughout the lifetime of a sheep. Especially in the Midwest, we don't see very much rough terrain, so it's hard for them to keep those hooves worn down like some other regions of the US. So trimming may be needed, and this helps prevent foot rot and lameness because if their hooves get really long, sometimes it makes it difficult for them to walk. So this is just simply trimming the edge of the hoof back to the natural plane of the hoof. So we can see in our picture here, she's just going to trim off this long part and leave it to this natural plane. And then finally, we have shearing. So shearing is done once or twice a year, especially important before the summer months. So right now actually is the ideal time to start shearing sheep for large producers. This is just the removal of the wool, and we've talked about in the wool evaluation lecture that they pull all of that wool off in one large piece to make a fleece. And then some producers will also tag their sheep before breeding, and this is just the removal of the wool around the dock, which is where the tail was, and then the mammary glands to help the babies be able to reach that udder, and then also help with cleanliness in the birthing process. So tagging is the name of that, removing the wool around the dock and mammary glands. So that is all I have for you today. If you did not, check out the guided notes, and then there will be a quiz over this. And again, this is my last lecture with you guys, so thank you so much for being a great class, and have a great summer.